be more at one end.
Nee?
Nee, sie kommt nicht.
Das müssen Sie das ausschlagen.
Hello everyone, can you hear me? Anna, can you? Hi everyone. Good morning. Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Thilo. I'm a press officer for the European Parliament and I have the pleasure to welcome you to the European House. I know some of you are from out of town, so just for your background, I guess half of the participants, maybe 2/3 are participants that will go on later to the Political Tech Summit, and another third, another half are stakeholders from the European Parliament here in Berlin, so it's quite a diverse crowd. And I'm very happy to see so much interest here. On this day, you can hear from my voice that I'm also not in the best of shapes, and I should pass on greetings from my boss, our head of unit, Judith, who also had to call in sick, and I guess we see a few empty spaces here. A few more people fell ill, so all the best for you guys. Stay safe, stay healthy, have a good and fruitful summit for those of you that continue. And I'm very happy to welcome you to this panel discussion on hybrid threats for the European democracy, which we organized in cooperation with the Political Tech Summit. I see Josef in the background. He's basically the organizer with a very dedicated group, so you'll see more of him when you see more of the summit on today and tomorrow. I know that one of our speakers, Lena Düpont, a German member of the European Parliament, will also hold a workshop or a panel there. No, I'm sorry. Oh, God. It was a busy week. I just came back from Strasbourg, and you can imagine that world politics aren't quite quiet at the moment, so there was a lot of stuff happening simultaneously. Just before we start with our panel debate, some information on what to expect in the next 2 hours. We have our two speakers, Martha Turnbull and our moderator, Chris Coakley, who will introduce Lena Düpont and Martha Turnbull more in detail. Just for you to know, Martha is a researcher from the European Center of Excellence on Hybrid Threats in Helsinki, Finland, and she complained that it's too cold in Berlin. I thought she would be used to cold temperatures, but apparently we can compete. Different kind of cold. Lena, as I said, is an MEP who worked extensively on our topic today, but also disaster preparedness in the European Parliament. And Chris, our moderator, is from the spokesperson's service, so the central spokesperson's hub in Brussels, working on disinformation for more than 5 years now, so he's really hands-on. I think he can contribute a few interesting things today. We'll start with a bit of a background, a context from Martha, and then we'll give you guys some time for questions, for a little debate with her. Then Lena will present the European Parliament's point of view, what we do, what we may be not doing yet. And then we'll have a little panel debate moderated by Chris. More time for you guys to talk, to discuss, bring in your points of view. If you don't have to rush away after 12, there'll be a few snacks out there, some coffee, some water, if you want to chat a bit more, network a bit more. If we've got time in the end, depending on how much time we need for question and answers, Chris might present a few of the very simple day-to-day things we do in Parliament when we're faced with wrong messages, misinformation on European democracy, on how we work as peaceful societies here in Europe. Then we'll have a bit of this as well. Otherwise, we'll go straight to coffee. That's it from my side for now. As you've seen in the invitation, there is live streaming. We also have a few people filming here. Just so to be aware of this, you can later on see the recording of this event on our YouTube page. Thank you very much for coming here, and I'm handing over to Chris for a little introduction of the speakers, and that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Thilo. So my name is Chris Coakley. I work at the spokespersons unit of the European Parliament. I had a little chat with Thilo before this, and he said, should I introduce you as an expert? And I said, my God, I don't know. Because I've been working on it 5 years, and of course it's a very complex topic, very fast-moving topic, so I would say maybe after another 5 years we can come back and do this again, and Thilo can introduce me as an expert. There's no better place to talk about democracy and issues around it than Berlin. For someone of my generation, I grew up in England, but I used to watch the news with my parents on TV. Do you remember that? We consume news a little bit differently these days. But back then, maybe I can remember 2 or 3 news stories as they happened. It's a very vivid memory for me. And of course, one of those is the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's only my 3rd time in Berlin, so to see the wall, this kind of symbol of division, now with graffiti and messages, now sort of a symbol of communication, is very powerful. But now, at that time, there was even a historian who said, maybe this is the end of history. We've reached the pinnacle. We've got our Western liberal democracy. We've figured it all out. And I suppose for those of you who've been watching Davos and speeches in Davos over the last week, that's not the message at all. We're hearing maybe about a new world order. So I'm really looking forward to navigating this new space with the speakers. The work we do at the European Parliament on disinformation, we have a relatively small team working on it, but we look to monitor and analyze the information operations that target the European Parliament. We organize a certain amount of training. We work together with a lot of others to do awareness raising. When you came in, maybe you saw some little purple leaflets saying vote for turtle. That's a game we've developed with the European External Action Service that looks at the different behaviors of disinformation and how to spot it in a fun way. But getting into the topic now, it's evolved very fast, as I said. So back in 2017, one of the big dictionaries named fake news as the sort of word of the year or phrase of the year. And of course, it was far too simplistic. It was a very politicized term, a very reductive term. So now that we're talking about hybrid threats just a few years later, it shows, I think, the evolution of the challenges and also the evolution of our understanding. It's a really significant week in the European Parliament because we have a draft report from our special committee, of which Lena Düpont is a member, so we're looking forward to hearing more on that. But before we get into that, I'm going to hand over to Martha Turnbull. Martha Turnbull is a director at the European Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats. She is director specifically of the Hybrid Influence Community of Interest. It's a lot of words. I'm glad I wrote those down. Perhaps you can tell us what a community of interest is and how that works. But first of all, I think it would be really helpful for us if you could set the scene, talk a bit more specifically about what we mean when we're talking about hybrid threats. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today in Berlin. So, as Chris said, my name is Martha Turnbull, and I'm the Director of Hybrid Influence at the Hybrid CoE based in Helsinki. And I can confirm that a community of interest is something that we use in the Hybrid CoE, which basically means that we are a team of analysts physically located in Helsinki, but we build a community of interest on the topics that we cover, which extends across all of our participating states, into their governments, but also into NGOs and CSOs based in those countries as well. So that's why we call it a community of interest. So for those of you who are not aware of the Hybrid CoE, I thought I'd just do a very quick overview of who we are and what we do, just so that you can build your understanding. So the Hybrid CoE was established in 2017 by 9 states and has since grown to still include 36 participating states. And we work with all of those states as well as the EU and NATO as organisations in order to improve their understanding of hybrid threats, but we also work with them to deliver training and exercising in order to improve their capabilities to counter hybrid threats. And we're working primarily with the governments in those countries, but as I said, we do also reach out into research, academia and CSOs as well. So we are essentially a bit of a think and do tank. So we have lots of analysts with deep expertise on topics like Russia and China, maritime security, lawfare, but we also deliver external events as well and conferences in order to build those communities of interest and to bring everybody together. And we see our role as being this international hub of experts with networks all the way across the Euro-Atlantic. And you can see on this slide a few examples of the types of events that we have run. So we have an annual conference for practitioners which takes place in Helsinki, exploring the topic of elections and threats to elections. We also recently went to Albania to talk about threats within the Western Balkans region. And the final example on there is our work on social identities and targeted disinformation, which is particularly looking into gender and how that plays into disinformation. If you're interested in any of those, please do take a look at our website and there's a lot more information, or find me afterwards. So what I'm going to now talk about is hybrid threats, and I thought before we get into the detail, it would be good to give you an understanding of how we at the Hybrid CoE see hybrid threats and how we define hybrid threats. So this is the definition that we use at the CoE. So we are looking at actions that are conducted by states and non-state actors, and we're looking at those actions that they conduct in order to undermine or harm a target. And increasingly that means that they're using overt and covert, military and non-military means to do that. I'd say the key trend for me that stands out is the increased use of non-state actors to conduct these kinds of activities and the crossover into organised crime in order to find individuals to conduct these sorts of activities. Essentially what this means is that we're looking at anything that falls short of conventional warfare. So the hybrid threats are otherwise known as the grey zone, a bit more colloquially. But none of this is new. So this is something that we have been seeing for a very long time. And a key thing to remember here is that this is old threats in a new environment when we're talking about hybrid threats. And some of their objectives really are around having coordinated and synchronized actions in order to amplify what it is that they are trying to do. So they're seeking to exploit our vulnerabilities through a variety of means, which is problematic when we think about the response to it. So some of these hybrid threat actors are simultaneously conducting cyber attacks. They are targeting our critical infrastructure, they're targeting our democratic systems, and they're also conducting individuals in order to conduct sort of attacks using UAVs, some of the attacks that we've seen across Europe on critical infrastructure as well, and also using the shadow fleet. So it's a variety of different tools and tactics that they're using at the same time in order to present the threat. One of the key things that makes it really challenging from a response perspective is that these types of threats are created in order to exploit thresholds of detection and attribution. So the reason why we don't see the states being behind these attacks quite so easily is because they have done that on purpose. So recruiting individuals, using non-state actors, recruiting sort of low-level criminals in order to obtain a weapon to conduct an attack. These are the kinds of things that make it really difficult for us to be able to pinpoint exactly where the attack is linked back to and then to make the attribution. And the final thing to say is that all of these attacks, although it might seem like these are different isolated incidents, they are designed to influence our decision making and reduce our will to try and tackle the problem. Now, this can be a bit of a terrifying slide when you first look at it, but I promise you it's not as terrifying as it looks. This is something that we at the Hybrid CoE developed with our colleagues at the European Commission to be able to kind of conceptualize what we mean by hybrid threats. And there's a whole publication on our website that details this, in a lot more detail than I'm going to be able to go into. But the key thing to take away is that when we're looking at hybrid threats and the types of threats that we're currently seeing, there are kind of two basic categories, which are on the left-hand side of the slide, where you have state actors and non-state actors. But what's really important is that when you look at the tools, so the things that they are doing, which are in grey, the next section over, there's that overlap that begins immediately. So we can start on one side and say, this is a state actor, this is a non-state actor. But when we get into the tools that they're using and the types of activity that they're conducting, it starts to then cross over and become much more complicated. This does not aim to show all of the different tools that we see from hybrid threat actors, but just to give you an example of the most popular types of threat vectors that we're seeing. And we use this to be able to encourage our participating states to conduct that analysis within their states themselves to better understand what the threat picture looks like. It then goes on to kind of categorize domains, as we call them, and then the types of activity. But ultimately, it then, having sort of gotten very complicated, and we call this our spaghetti slide, lots of different lines everywhere, what it gets to on the other side is that the objective here is to undermine our decision-making capability. So you have two types of actors, lots of things in the middle, very, very complicated, very hard for us to work out what's really going on. But what they're trying to do is the same ultimate objective on the other side. A couple of key trends just to highlight from the analysis that we are conducting at the Hybrid CoE. First of all, that we see hybrid threats are really the kind of new normal. Everybody's talking about it now. And we continue to see this trend growing and growing, certainly in the short to medium term. We believe that Russia is seeking to create strategic dilemmas for the West. We see increasingly hostile activities in the Baltic and Black Sea region. We see targeting of critical infrastructure, including using UAVs and attacks against railways. We see election interference as well in Moldova and other European countries being linked back to Russia. And we see Russia seeking to expand its influence in Africa and Latin America. So that threat is not going to go away, regardless of how the conflict in Ukraine ends. On China, we see that there is a significant hybrid threat potential, but questions about to what extent this will be realized. We do see examples of weaponizing economic dependencies. We see sophisticated info operations and cyber operations and capabilities, and particularly on how they're using artificial intelligence to support that. We also see expansion into outer space and capabilities around their space program as well. And we see increasing influence in the global south from China as well. We are seeing examples of growing cooperation between the different hybrid threat actors, and we think that that will continue as well. We see some crossover on the war in Ukraine, but also on strategic narratives and historical perspectives, which will continue to be there. But the key thing to remember for this cooperation point is that there are major differences between these hybrid threat actors, and that sort of genuine, fully trusting, genuine alliance is not there. So there are vulnerabilities which can be exploited within that cooperation that we're seeing. So information operations, this is something that sits within my team in the Hybrid CoE, and we have dedicated analysts looking at disinformation and how to counter disinformation, otherwise known as information operations. So if we start with the objective, so what is it that these hostile actors are trying to achieve through these information operations? Firstly, they're trying to manipulate public opinion, whether that is on big things or small things, that's what they're trying to do. They're also trying to fuel polarization within societies. So generally they have a pretty good understanding of our societies and where those vulnerabilities sit and how to exploit them. So we see activity, for example, on referendum, lots of examples of where states have held referendums, and we have seen hostile state activity linked to that. But also seeking to interfere with the democratic process, so big spikes in disinformation in the lead up to elections as well. They are seeking to destabilize our societies by creating that polarization and manipulating what it is that we think and we feel. They are also trying to undermine our alliances and our relationships, whether that's with each other or to undermine multilateral organizations themselves and their purpose. I have a couple of slides which set out Russia's information operations and China's information operations at a very strategic level, and I'm very happy to talk afterwards in more detail about this. But what we see from Russia is essentially a weaponization of information, and in their view, information warfare. So information is a key tactic when it comes to their approach to warfare. We see them using state and non-state structures, so you'll have heard of things like troll farms that they make use of and influential individuals, but we also see the state conducting this kind of activity as well. The key thing for Russia is that it sees this as a long-term strategy, and so it devotes significant resource to this activity, both at home and abroad. Could be anywhere from sort of $2 billion a year upwards. Some of the estimates suggest that that's how much Russia spends on its information operations. And we see them seeking to understand and exploit vulnerabilities, which means that we see them try to exploit divisions both on the extreme left, on the extreme right, and on particular issues as and when they come up as well. So it's really just trying to make everything much more complicated and to sow those divisions within societies. When we look at China, things are slightly different. So we have seen a bit of an evolution of China's information operations. So pre-2019, it was primarily defensive and overt in its activities. But from 2019 onwards, we see more of a shift to offensive and also covert, some of that linked to COVID-19 and trying to sort of push back on the narratives that we saw within the West, but also increased targeting of critical voices, whether that's on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, or other issues as well. We see an expansion of their state-controlled media footprint, so buying up media resources in other countries, and we see content being created in coordination with those foreign entities. Right now, I would say there's an increasing convergence of China and Russia's TTPs in information operations and support to extreme political parties, both on the far left and the far right, in order to try and confuse our understanding of what's really going on. So all of that seems particularly difficult, doesn't it? Lots of people doing things that we would ideally not like them to be doing. So how can we counter disinformation? Well, at the Hybrid CoE, we have a model which we call our 4 lines model. And this is quite a simple way of trying to explain how states can invest in their capacity to try and counter disinformation. So firstly, we say that states should invest in their abilities to detect, react, and document examples of disinformation. And this really kind of sets them up for the rest of what's on this slide. So where states can better understand where the disinformation threat is coming from, who's responsible for it, what are the key themes, they're better prepared to then be able to respond. And a lot of that seems fairly obvious, but for some of our states, this is something that we've seen them needing to put a bit more investment into. The second line is around raising awareness. So once you've got that data of what's happening, you can then think about, how do I communicate this? How do I help the entire system, so not just the government system, but going beyond into civil society as well, to better talk about this threat and raise awareness of what those weaknesses look like that the threat actors are trying to exploit. Which leads on to the third line, which is really looking at societies themselves. So what are the weaknesses there? Sometimes this can be around media literacy, on digital literacy, but also really looking kind of critically at the state itself and what these threat actors are trying to exploit. Why are there parts of the population who feel further from the government than others, and how do you try and repair that? The final line is something that we're seeing increasingly states investing in, but this has been quite a new development where we're talking about punishing and deterring the aggressors. So it's not just using sanctions, but it's using a full range of tools that they have at their disposal in order to really push back against the individuals responsible for disinformation. So the other work that's covered in my team is on safeguarding democracies. So we have a program of work on this, and as I said, we have our annual conference as well. When we think about threats to the elections, there are 2 things that hybrid threat actors are seeking to do here. Firstly, they're seeking to undermine the conduct of the election. So this is the kind of nuts and bolts of how elections are carried out. So information about how you can vote, the participation, the turnout, but also the vote counting, all of those types of things around how a democracy actually functions. But they are also, and this is really important and the link into disinformation here, they are seeking to undermine general trust in the conduct of the election. So even though an election may happen, and we all know that it's free and fair, the threat actors seek to exploit that and seek to say, are you sure about the conduct of this election? Or to try and persuade people not to go and vote because the elections aren't fair. Those are the kinds of activities that we see from them. And it's important to say here that we see activity taking place from foreign actors, but also from domestic actors. And this can be quite a difficult conversation for some of our participating states who don't have so much ability to look at domestic actors and tend to be primarily focused on foreign actors. This slide is from a paper which our colleague Sebastian Bay wrote for the Hybrid CoE, also available on our website, which seeks to categorize the types of threats that we see when it comes to elections. And I've added these orange circles on here just to show that if you drew a line down the middle and had foreign actors on the left and domestic actors on the right, you would see that all of those ones which do not have an orange circle are exactly the same on both sides. So the majority of the activity that we're seeing, the tools and the tactics that are being used on both sides are the same, with the exception of the orange circled ones, which are different. And this just reflects the fact that particularly on the domestic actors side, these are actors who are in country and more able to conduct these threats and violence against poll workers and against the infrastructure and sabotage the election process because they are in country. Those are kind of some of the main differences. But again, we see sort of cyber attacks, trust in the election process, and influencing the election process being the key categories for the types of threats we see. A couple of trends that we see. So disinformation is the biggest one. It's growing, especially in relation to elections, and we tend to see a spike in election-related disinformation in the run-up to elections, but also immediately afterwards to try and undermine trust in the process itself. And this is conducted by foreign and domestic actors. Sometimes there's a connection between the two. There's tasking from foreign actors to domestic ones, but sometimes they just operate independently, but with the same shared narratives. We also see increasingly the role of artificial intelligence and large language models linked to the point on disinformation. So we see AI being able to allow threat actors to translate information more quickly, to create the disinformation and to disseminate it much more quickly. So that is sort of starting to change the game in terms of the disinformation that we see. We're also seeing targeting of fact-checkers and newsrooms. So Russia's operation recently in particular focusing on trying to sort of overwhelm some of these fact-checking systems that we have established within our societies. It's just one example of the types of activity that we see here. We also see cyber attacks, so trying to get data on the electorate, but also conducting DDoS attacks against, for example, the website of the Electoral Commission within a particular country, are types of things that we continue to see and will continue to see going forward. And the final one is rarer, but still worth considering in that we do see lots of examples of physical threats to members of parliament. And this is something that clearly is very worrying. We also see harassment, and a lot of that tends to have a gender element to it as well. So how do we protect elections? Well, you'll be pleased to know that like our work on countering disinformation, we also have a very jazzy slide on how to protect elections. So this is in two categories, and there's a report on our website with lots more detail, as you can imagine. But the first thing is that we encourage our states to work collaboratively across the system. And there are some great examples of states that have set up special task forces to deal with election interference. And those are kind of their ideas around best practice of how to do this. It's not just the responsibility of one ministry to respond. It's about bringing the whole system together. But it's not just about how the government responds, it is about how the government is able to bring together a whole of society approach that brings in CSOs and the private sector who also have their role in trying to help build resilience within societies and respond to these threats. Communication is a really key part of this, and this is about communicating the threat itself so people know what to expect, what to spot, and how to respond to it. And this can include working with politicians from across the political spectrum in order to build their understanding and their responses as well. Monitoring the information environment is obviously really important and something that requires significant investment to better understand what these narratives look like and how to respond to them. But ideally also, we're not just talking about responding, but we're talking about getting ahead of the narrative. So pre-bunking is really important. And the final thing to mention is that we see election protection as something that should exist as a long-term strategy. So we see electoral cycles come and go, we see political parties and their sort of dominance of the system coming and going as well. but investing in protecting elections is something that should be there throughout that process and beyond. It is not something that you can just do 6 months prior to an election and hope for the best. You need to have long-term, multi-year strategies embedded within systems in order to be able to protect your elections. So that's all I was going to say, and I look forward to your questions.
So thank you very much. It's a lot to take in. Just to remind you, we'll have a few rounds of discussion. So we'll take some questions now specifically on what Martha was describing with the work of her organization. So it's really helpful if the questions you have are specifically on that, because we'll have a round of questions also after Lena Düpont speaks, and then a broader discussion of the issues. I see already one at the back and at the front. So maybe we'll take at least two at a time, and we'll have time, I think, for all the questions.
Okay, hi, Raphael Boston,
Just
German
very
Institute.
briefly, just to ask you, please do introduce yourself before you, and make sure you have a question as well as a statement. Thank you very much.
Raphael Boston, German Institute for International Security Affairs. One technical and one maybe overly sensitive question. One technical, so I know the center has a lot of publications. I just wondered whether there's anything in the public domain you can also refer to as quantitative data. I know the hybrid threat field is very broad. Last autumn there has been some attempts done by RUSI, and I don't see enough quantitative data. I think that would be interesting. Now to the political question. I'm not sure what the actual state of it is, but as far as I'm informed, the Trump administration announced its withdrawal from the Hybrid Threat Center, among other 66 international organizations. So maybe you have a comment on that, and maybe even more sensitive, but feel free to take it or not. I think a lot of people have this thought at the back of their mind that we see this kind of, or part of this kind of activity from the US itself. And while we're not ready to hit back hard, the question is this analysis already seeping into your work, that we see this from at least MAGA actors?
Okay, shall I take one more question and we group together a little bit? One right at the front here, I think was before, and then we'll come back to you. Right at the front, yeah.
You might remember or not, hybrid war was invented by the Chinese 2,000 years ago. They said you don't need to conquer the walls, but the brains of your enemies. So expect more from them, because they are also world leader in AI. But my question is very specific and topical. There was a catastrophic vote in the European Parliament this week, and another one, in fact, yesterday. Do you think, or can you exclude, that the result of this vote is a consequence of hybrid attack, which parliamentarians have been attacked in order to lose their brain and follow populist extreme lobbying? Do we know whether any green activists from Latin America or, of course, Eastern Europe, Chinese, whatever, could have been involved? It's perhaps also a question to Madame Düpont, how you see as an individual MP under cyber attacks. I don't know how you might have experience in what you receive in the social media every day.
Thank you very much. So a few different questions there about quantitative data, what's publicly available, about US actions, about the Chinese. Just to remind, this is a first round of questions specifically on Martha's presentation, so we'll do another round of questions after Lena Düpont speaks, so maybe questions related to the European Parliament would best come then, and then we'll have a broader discussion for everything. So we will have time for a broader list of questions then. Over to you, Martha.
So on quantitative data, I agree completely. I wish there was more in this space, and I know that there are lots of individual initiatives across our participating states that are seeking to invest in this. So hopefully more in the pipeline to come. The hybrid CoE itself, unfortunately, doesn't have the resources to get into that space. We only have 50 analysts in Helsinki, and we would need a lot more to be able to do that. There are some good examples. So I know that the Associated Press has a very good website that tries to track some of this threat activity that we're seeing. We ourselves at the Hybrid CoE have a paper which is based on survey data on disinformation from our participating states to better understand how they see the problem and how they're investing in their response mechanisms. So that gets into it a little bit. And we have a forthcoming paper which is going to look at Russia's information operations and try to get into some of the detail on how much are they spending, how are they spending it, where are they spending it, and to get the data attached to that. So 2 examples of the types of things that we do, but generally that kind of threat tracking bit, unfortunately we're not resourced to be able to do that. The US withdrawal, so I think we have all seen that declaration around the 66 institutions that the US is withdrawing from, and the Hybrid CoE is named on that list. We have not yet had any formal notification of the US withdrawing, so we haven't received that directly to our centre. So we continue to see them as a part of our centre until we get that notice. I think... Yes, and then maybe on that point around sort of politicians and voting and populism, I think what we are seeing in this kind of wider backdrop piece is that political currents are changing, and different people are being voted into parliaments within all sorts of different countries who come with a slightly different narrative to one that we've seen before, which is around looking much more sort of domestically focused and sort of moving away from some of these big sort of international spaces that they've been in previously. And I don't think that we have enough evidence at the moment to show that this is some kind of coordinated effort on behalf of a hybrid threat actor. But I would say that what we have seen, and you'll have seen the media reporting on this, around an individual called Nathan Gill, who's recently been jailed for 10.5 years in the UK under the Bribery Act. He was a politician who was being bribed by individuals linked to Russia in order to conduct media interviews which were favourable to Russia. That's one example. I'm sure there are lots more as well, where individuals who have specific vulnerabilities that can be exploited by hybrid threat actors certainly are present there, and that is a risk that we need to continue to manage and better understand.
Great. Any further questions specifically for Martha, or specific concerning the work of Hybrid CoE? Yes, there's one here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Christian Madsen. I'm from DemAI, Democracy AI. We try to use AI to strengthen democracy. So, 2 very quick, perhaps a bit technical questions. One is about pre-bunking. So, of course, it's better than debunking, but to some extent, it's also allowing the threat actor to control the narrative, isn't it? So, how do you manage that? The other one is around AI. So we have seen some attempts by some threat actors to start doing poison the well attacks, so making a lot of fake news sites and letting that influence the training of new AIs. I think there was an example of a fake news story with a Danish fighter pilot that was shot down over Ukraine. But we haven't had, we haven't had any fighter pilots in Ukraine. Yet some of the chat agents started talking about that too when you asked it. So how do we defend against that?
Very good questions.
If there is one, yes, just behind. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Valian from National Democratic Institute, NDI. Very good presentation, and I think easy or hard way, we are learning more on Russian disinformation efforts in Europe, and we're understanding more of that. But I'm not sure if we're understanding right the Chinese disinformation efforts from Europe, and whether we are doing enough in Europe to understand that culturally and the real aims and priorities of Chinese disinformation efforts. My questions would be 2 or 3-folded. One, what we are doing more to cooperate with Taiwan to understand more of a frontline fight and counter that they are doing to Chinese disinformation. From our cooperation with them, we have learned a lot from that front. What are the primary objectives of Chinese disinformation efforts and malign misinformation, information efforts in Europe? And do they converge or diverge with Russian where and how. Thank you.
Okay, a couple of small, easy questions for you there, Martha. So just a reminder, we will come back and discuss very broadly, and I want to bring in Lena Düpont as soon as possible afterwards. So would you like to do this round of questions, and then we'll turn over to Lena Düpont, if that's okay? If that
I was
works
just
for you.
about, fully Martha's turn now. And I will pick up a few things later on in my words, and of course then also in the question. The thing now was, I need a paper and a pencil. So
Yeah.
very non-hybrid things.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I think there's an hour-long lecture in both of those questions, which I won't give you. You'll be pleased to hear. Pre-bunking and control of the narrative first. Yes, one of the questions that we still get is around disinformation versus Ministry of Truth and how we kind of get around that. I think personally, for me, pre-bunking is more about states trying to understand the potential narratives at a strategic level. So what are the vulnerabilities within our societies? What are the things that threat actors might seek to exploit? And how do we invest in tackling the issue alongside the messaging? So it's not just about a state coming out and saying, we know that next week, tomorrow, whenever, you're going to be told this, and this is incorrect, and we're telling you the truth, and we are the only source of truth. But it's about creating a society that's better able to question the information that is presented to them, the source of that information, and to be able to have those conversations themselves. And then pre-bunking sits on top of that, where you can then say, okay, we know that this is coming. Let's present the truth to you. It is up to you who you want to choose. But ideally, when you've invested in that level of media and digital literacy and built your trust with the population, it should make it easier to be able to do that. But it is all connected. The training of AI tools, and particularly on LLMs, so a bit of a plug for a paper that we're issuing. A colleague in my team is almost ready to issue, which compares and contrasts Russia and China's approach to artificial intelligence, specifically relating to information operations. And one of the key things that's highlighted in that report is how both of those countries are seeking to either, in China's case, create new LLMs that compete with those that we're already using. In Russia's case, to try and pollute the LLMs that we're already using. Both sides, that is a problem, because you have, on China's side, the creation of DeepSeek and the threats around how that could be used or manipulated by the state itself in order to control the information that's provided. And on the Russia side, there are lots of examples already of ways in which LLMs have already been tested against Russian narratives and have proven that they are showing up these Russian narratives in response. The other thing which relates to elections on those is that we're working with a number of our participating states who have flagged that some of these LLMs, if you ask them, who should I vote for? Or when is the election being held? They're also showing up incorrect information in response to those questions as well, or they're sort of choosing particular parties and not giving the whole kind of political spectrum. So I think there's a lot more that we need to do to invest in better understanding those risks and how to tackle them. But obviously the cooperation there sits with the tech companies themselves. Do we understand China enough? So I think the cooperation with Taiwan is really important, and understanding that kind of best practice, because as you say, there are a number of examples there, whether it's on election protection, whether it's on disinformation, where we see really good practice that we absolutely should be understanding better and implementing. On the objectives of China's disinformation in Europe, I think I sort of hinted at some of it, but with time didn't go into the detail on it. I think some of this has really changed from a space where it is sort of promoting China into a kind of defending China space, but also increasingly now a space where a lot of the narratives are quite similar to Russia. So we have seen examples where in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, in some countries, there were immediate actions to remove websites that were linked back to the Russian state. Those websites were removed, and the next day, new websites appeared that were linked to China that had exactly the same narrative as before. So that crossover in narrative, I think, is quite concerning, and we need to better understand how that works.
Great. So before we go further, I think a lot of those questions, a lot of those issues also concern the European Parliament. So we're delighted to have a member of the European Parliament here, Lena Düpont, who's been a member of the European Parliament since 2019. So you're already on your second term. And even going earlier, you're no stranger to the European Parliament. You've worked in the European Parliament in different capacities and politics. You sit on the Committee for Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, also on agriculture, which is one of the very contested information topics right now. So just so you can predict a question that might be coming on that later. And very relevant to this, you're also on the Special Committee on the European Democracy Shield, where your colleague has presented a draft report. So we're looking forward to hear your perspective. Thank you.
Well, then, first of all, good morning also from my side, and a warm thanks to the European House here in Berlin for hosting that debate, that discussion today. And I think already from the first outset, and thanks to Martha for her introductory remark, which were way broader than only introductory remarks, but really a deep dive into a very complex, a very complicated, but also a very important topic. And let me probably start with a bit of a personal story here, because when I decided to run, actually in 2018, for the election in 2019, it was not only because of my previous work in the European Parliament, and in brackets also in the German Bundestag, by the way, so the political system of both parliaments work quite similar from time to time, and sometimes very differently, which is very interesting to compare, and also helpful to understand some political processes, of course. But more importantly, actually, one of the key drivers was the Brexit. Because I grew up in a European Union that kind of promised stability, freedom, economic prosperity. I was born in '86, so as you referred to the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was kind of, I was 4 years old, and it was like, you know, at that day, it was probably more important for me what my peer group in the kindergarten had done and said, but I, of course, sensed that something had happened because my parents reacted in a very touched way. This was a so-called, as of today, we would call it a Zeitenwende, but it was a constructive one. There were immensely huge tasks ahead of us, ahead of this country, but they were going into a constructive direction. And Brexit probably was the first publicly very visible sign of a Zeitenwende, like we call it later on, but in a not constructive way. And this is the time we're basically in. And I guess that everyone had a sense of a feeling that the world is dramatically, rapidly, very dynamically changing. We don't know yet what's the outcome of it. We are in the midst of the process. And that means we also need to steer the process as good and as much as we can. And at the very heart of that, of course, is our way of living, our way of doing politics, our way of functioning as a society, which is a democratic one. Having said that, this event or this discussion here today is also seen as a bit of an opportunity to raise awareness. Because what we see, and Martha very elegantly and experienced pointed out to the various tools, the various actors, the various domains, and I'm very happy that you actually used the spaghetti for you, because I really, really like that. It can be overwhelming, but if you look at it, and if you have a closer look, it can also help understanding and shaping and structuring the answer to that. So this event today also is a bit of a try to say we're raising awareness and we're trying to make people understand the scale, the intensity, and also the gravity of things that are happening. And of course, like I just referred to the spaghetti part of your presentation, it is a complex task we have had. It's a complex, sometimes threat, sometimes challenge, sometimes something we just need to kind of refer back to our previous instruments and answers. But because it is a complex issue and it covers a whole variety of domains, we also need to have a complex answer. Point here is we need to be careful that we are not over-coordinating, that we are not over-complexity, that we are not finding structures that kind of mirror each and every complex challenge, but find answers that are flexible, but at the same time structural, so that we can become ahead of what is in front of us. A bit like Martha, and you were just saying about the question on debunking, pre-bunking. It's a reaction, but the real, I would say, the real first-class reaction is being ahead of, and not only behind. Nothing less that we have at our hands. And as you can imagine, as a member of the European Parliament, we are trying and we are kind of also finding our ways through that as well. And let me probably also enrich Martha's presentation with a few examples because they make it more concrete. When we look at the recent elections in Moldova, for example, we've seen bomb threats against polling stations. We've seen disinformation campaigns not only targeting the state and the political parties, but also individual politicians. We've seen numerous attempts to undermine election processes as such. By the way, we also see that within the European Union. Remember the Romanian election just a few months ago, where surprisingly, shortly before the election, a back then not known as a political actor, politician had come up with a huge amount of social media accounts supporting his run for the election. And it was discovered, and it was also attributed back then, luckily, that it was not a, I would say, organic growth of social media profiles that were backing him. You had the example of the Danish fighter jet. Remember that was a rather small one, but nonetheless visible, at least in the German public sphere, when Merz, Macron and Starmer were going to Ukraine. The question about the tissue and cocaine came up. We also have a story about, and this is, I would say, it's the most bizarre one actually, but also the most, probably popular one, is remember the headlines we had about Merz going to the Arctic just to hunt animals. We had actually pictures of that, or things that pretend to be pictures. When you had a closer look, you of course saw that they were fake. We had the question, and you also referred to that already, we had the question of Grok denying Holocaust. So clearly not only a statistical question of which kind of information goes into, with huge repercussion to our information integrity, society, and of course, specifically in Germany, to our historical responsibility and awareness. So these are the examples that really show us in that very, let's say, only one part of the toolbox when you look at hybrid threats overall, we are already in it. And we are deeper in it than actually some of us are ready or willing to acknowledge. And this is where we actually need to also start defending our democracies. Like you just said, it's about the hats of the people. Does that mean that we're perfect? Of course we're not, because we are built by humans. And we learn. And this is the beauty of a democratic system. We are able to learn, we are able to adapt. And of course, it needs a bit of a political strength to do that as well. One last example, probably connected to that, you remember the famous doppelganger campaign. So we had news outlets copying, specifically German newspapers like Spiegel, like FAZ, like the Frankfurter Rundschau, pretending to be an official, trustable information source. And you had basically articles just copied from the original page. And then you had articles who were completely bogus. Always, like it is with disinformation, came one small piece of checkable truth and a variety of stories around it, making it almost impossible to detect. And this is probably one of the first things where we need to start. It is about media literacy. You will hear that quite often, and you will hear that also in the work that we have been doing in the European Parliament. So let me or allow myself to go through a few examples of what we have been doing at European level. It's not only the European Democracy Shield, but I will also refer to some of the concrete strategies and papers we have at a European level already going into the implementation phase. But probably first of all, to the European Democracy Shield. The European Democracy Shield is the kind of follow-up on the so-called INGE 1 and 2 special committees of the European Parliament, where we, in the last term, focused specifically on information interference. And now, well, I would say, aus guten Gründen, you would say in Germany, we kind of enlarged it also to hybrid threats. Because remember, disinformation is only one part of it. It can also be linked to an act of sabotage. It can be linked to an act of an attack on critical infrastructure, and sometimes you will see all of them together in one place. So what did we do at European level? And the draft report was already referenced to. But the draft report, and have in mind, it's yet a draft report, so the ongoing political discussion will need to continue in the European Parliament, focuses on the so-called European Centre for Democratic Resilience. It is a proposal already coming from the Commission. What we said as parliamentarians, we wanted to be operational earlier on than the Commission wants to see it. We want to have a clear legal base for that, because whenever we set up a centre at European level, it needs to be, and it needs to have a clear legal basis. We want to have decision-making powers for that centre. And connected to that, because we are a democracy, of course, we want to have political oversight, democratic oversight from the side of the Parliament. The centre as such is the attempt to kind of not only map and build on the experiences of member states, specifically when it's about countering hybrid threats, but also enlarge the coordination and let's say the defragmentation of European answers to that. So what we see so far, one good example I would say, you might have noticed that the strategic communication of the French Foreign Ministry changed recently. If you haven't seen it yet, look at French response. It's actually a very elegant, funny, and also very good way of not only countering disinformation, but really setting also your own narrative. And I guess we will speak about narratives later on. Second part of the draft report is our own digital resilience. You heard a lot about DSA, DMA. We also had the so-called EMFA when it's about media freedom, the Media Freedom Act. And of course, we have the AI Act. It was referenced a little bit already too. What we're doing in the European Parliament now, specifically when you look at AI and when you look at data, of course, we're trying to, I would say, modernize and at the same time make it more functional, more practical, our rules on data and AI. And you've heard in the previous weeks, I would say rather often, the DSA, specifically when it's about the question on the responsibility of platforms and their societal outreach, I would say. I think the most important point here is basically the connection, of course, not only in the debate, but to the overall question for a democracy, how to protect freedom of speech, and at the same time make sure that democratic processes can work properly. So let me probably say a very general thing on that. The DSA in no way is running against free speech. What the DSA does is increasing the responsibility of platforms to work transparently with their algorithm, but also with their financing model, and to make sure that each and everyone can have the same access to information. Grok denying Holocaust, probably not an example for the good side of it. So what we are doing at the European level is we're protecting fundamental rights of persons, but we do not allow bot farms, we do not allow fake accounts to just steer public opinion without any kind of basis. And this is something that, of course, will be a kind of horizontal task also for the next years to come. Third part of the draft report is the role and the responsibility of civil society. And there, I think, also connected to the debates we're having in the European Parliament, there is a lot about supporting engagement, supporting also the role of civil society, but at the same time, making sure that transparency is there, that we know of specifically of the financial resources of actors, not interfering, but being engaged in the public domain. The same thing we honestly also expect from parliaments, from politicians, from parliamentarians, for everyone who holds political responsibility. And then we're kind of going over, we're leaving a bit the information space, and we're going over to the question of resilience as such. And this is also touched upon in the report when we're speaking about protecting critical infrastructure. You've all seen the attacks on the cables in the Baltics. We've seen attacks on energy infrastructure, telecommunication, and a lot of other things. So basically all those elements, and here I'm kind of reverting a bit to the Finnish security diamond, which I very much love, where you can see the critical functions of a society that we need to protect. And of course, that's communication, that's energy, that's health, that's transport, that's the banking sector, and so on and so forth. And of course, also the public sphere and the political domain, so each and everyone's administration going from the communal level to the federal level and to the European level as well. So we see that there's an increasing attacks on those vital functions for the society, and we need to protect ourselves from that. And there, from the European angle, we of course also focus a lot on the cross-border cooperation of our response there, and of course coordinating also the European level response. For example, increasing resilience by redundant, supporting the build-up of redundant systems, or when you look specifically at the Baltics, also the discussion about acquiring one of the repair ships, because we don't have much at world scale, and none of them are in European hands. So it would be wise actually for us to better protect our critical infrastructure also via that. And then we are going over to what I call the trinity of the European Union in terms of our strategies and papers we have at hand. Why do I call it trinity? Because it's a link between whatever we do on the internal market for defense, the crisis preparedness strategy, the so-called Minister report, and whoever wants to have a look at it, I can clearly recommend it because it's a very broad, very good report focusing on the resilience and the preparedness of the European Union. And at the same time, there is a close connection. This is why it is the third part of the trinity, the internal security. Because we see, and I guess that each and every country by now has an example of that, we see a very close link between organized crime, individual actors, third countries being interested in steering fear, but also in destabilizing society and using so-called lonesome actors and the so-called Wegwerfagenten to conduct sabotage, to conduct attacks, even the smallest one like a color bomb against a house, which is conducted by far too often actually a minor. I remember one case from Sweden where actually a 16-year-old boy was caught with having 3 bombs in his backpack, and he was sent to an individual's house in order to throw the bombs at that house. He didn't know of which kind of person does live there, why he was sent there, but he just got the task, he got a bit of money, he got another social incentive to do that, and he had simply done that. Luckily, police caught him early on, but this is also part of the problem. We already touched upon the election system and our electoral resilience, and I think we can discuss it later on. But let me probably focus a bit with one last point on the question of preparedness, because preparedness starts with being aware of a risk, being aware of what the spaghetti folio had shown, trying to find answers to that. I wouldn't say we are not there yet in total, because it's an ongoing process. But like I said at the beginning, the world has changed dramatically, and one thing that is for sure, this will stay. So we are facing actually one of probably the most complicated, also demanding time ahead of us. We are not yet in a war, and specifically people from the German angle of this debate know that we're not yet in a war, but we're also not in peace times anymore, and we need to understand that. It can be overwhelming, it can be demanding, but ignoring it is simply the worst action we could possibly do. And I know that it can be frightening also from time to time, but fear is never a good advisor. It's an indicator for what is important to us, and we should use that in order to prepare our answer. And there are examples we can look at. Not only when you look at what I just said and refer to as the Trinity at European level, but also things where we can actually learn from our European neighbors. I touched upon the Finnish example, which is, in terms of resilience, one of the best actually you can look at. Because everyone knows what to do when crisis hit, irrespective of the nature of the crisis. Everyone knows where his place in society is once a crisis hit. And of course, preparedness is also implemented in each and every structure of the state. Not only society, not only economy, but really also in the state functions like that. Look at what the Hybrid CoE is doing, because they are not only doing an excellent work, it also helps understanding and forming our answers to that. And one last example I would recommend to have a look at is Viginum in France, doing an excellent work specifically on disinformation, foreign information manipulation, and countering that. And of course, something I would always refer to, because when you look at Sweden and the question of preparedness, the question of hybrid threats and how to encounter, Sweden is a bit of probably a bit more comparable to Germany, because they had been starting the process of preparing earlier than we in Germany did. So we can also look at their lessons learned. And now they're kind of nearing the Finnish model on many occasions. So this is very important for us to also have a look at. And there is one specific, let's say, government body, which is of interest, which I would also always refer to, which is the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency. And they are doing also an excellent work. There are a lot of other examples in Germany, in the European Union as well, where you can just refer to. My main message here is we do not have to face it alone. And I like to end with one of the things that both Martha and Chris were mentioning, just as a kind of side fact, actually. We're not alone in this. We have strong bonds with our European partners. We have strong partners worldwide. So we can and we need to cooperate as close as we can under the circumstances we are in, but we do not have to go through that alone. And I think that this actually probably is the best, I would say the best message to countering hybrid threats. It will be demanding, but we can do it together. Thanks.
So thank you very much. We'll have a round of questions for our MEP. Those of you on this side of the room, please feel free to wave extra high your hands, because I'm aware you're over one shoulder, so please don't be shy in moving more. I'd like to do the same as we did earlier, take a round of at least a couple of questions, and we still have plenty of time to discuss, so I'm sure we'll get to all of you. One here in the middle.
Hi, my name is Kirill, and I'm one of the executives in an organization called Dolus, where we provide the tools for fighting disinformation. So first, I would like to thank you for all the frameworks and papers and research that you are doing. And I would like to return your attention to the previous slide, where you have the state and non-state actors, the domains, the tools, and the targets. So looking at this, we see what's attacking the European Union. What do we have on our side? So we have states, non-state actors. We have the domains, but what are the tools that you see on a daily basis that are effective? And if budget is not an issue, what are the tools that you would like to have in order to effectively fight disinformation?
Thank you. We had one over on this side of the room. Yes, I think it was you, wasn't it? Yes. We'll take two at a time. So we have a round of answers after this one. Please do introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Mauritius from the Institute for the Strategic Dialogue. We are an organization fighting the full spectrum of extremism and also hybrid threats. I wanted to know, Martha mentioned local vulnerabilities, and I wanted to know, regarding the center you mentioned, Lena, what specific structures do we need in the subnational level to benefit actually from the center, and how do we get this linkage right?
So we have questions about tools and about structures. Let's do some. Maybe we do two at a time, because I know that otherwise the questions pile up. Is that okay with you? We'll start with those two, and we'll come to the others as soon as we can.
Well, Martha, feel free to come in at any time you want. But let's say focusing first on the question of what kind of tools do we have or do we need. Like I just referred to in my previous intervention, what we see at European level is a very broad approach by member states in actually A, being aware of hybrid threats and how they function, and B, creating reactions to that. So what I want to see at European level is a closer coordination of those answers, learning from the best experience, like I just said, from Sweden, from France, and to raise it up, or to scale it up if you want to say so, at European level. That also means that the European tools we have at hand, like the hybrid toolbox, like EU versus disinfo, need proper funding, they need proper staffing, and they also need to have the political mandate to actually perform the task, which also starts probably sometimes earlier on for those colleagues not working on hybrid threats or disinformation, because you know that the working structure, for example, of the Commission, but also of the Parliament is organized around the committees and the specific focus on the committees. That also intends and means that raising awareness also with my colleagues as well. So not only about the very nature of hybrid threats, because it's a bit like shadow boxing, yeah? Whenever you have a solution to one problem, the problem changes immediately and you need to find a new solution to that. So there, I do see the center, in real terms, in the center of coordinating our response to that, also enhancing the cooperation. And that goes a bit to the question of the structures. Because individual contribution from member states and doing their own homework back home will always be important. We will never be able to kind of do that for the member states, and the member states are out of the responsibility. Have in mind the European Union, no need to tell you, but the European Union is based on cooperation between the member states, having their own responsibility for their information sphere, for their preparedness, for their countering hybrid threats. What we can do and what we will do at European level is contribute with the coordination and thus enhancing the strength of the answer to the threat. And remember, one part of the hybrid threats, one part of the narrative is basically that individual member states are not ready or willing or able to respond to threats. So this is one of the narratives. Addressing state structures, but the same is there for the European Union. So the European Union, it's way too slow, it's way too complex, it will never be ready or able to fully deploy the full strength of the European Union. And this is also one of the underlying things, actually, because for some actors globally, a weak, a de-united European Union is actually more favorable due to economic reasons, due to political reasons, due to geopolitical reasons, than a bloc of 27. And this needs to be reflected, of course, in the structure as well. Having said that, again, we will never take up the responsibility or take away the responsibility from individual member states. They still need to find their own answers to that. And for that, you can look at European countries who actually have a very good reaction as well, Viginum in France, or for example, Sweden, the Finns as well. And I think that this is what we can actually deliver from the European perspective to that. Additionally, it will not work without society taking up their responsibility as well. Because we cannot just simply write in law that we have a democratically functioning society. Because democracies consist of all of us. Of course, I, as an elected politician, I do have a specific role, a very dignified role, a very important role, but I alone will never be able to protect democracies. It needs us in the room here, not only here in the room, but as well. And that also means that we need to engage in democracies, because democracy are not just there for taking. You need to actively engage and feed into the political system. And I think that this is also something really taking up our responsibility in the field of hybrid threats as well.
Martha, would you like to add to that?
Just to say that there's a paper that's on our website that was issued in September last year, which seeks to get into this question of how do we respond and what are the gaps and what do we need to fill them. And I think it's really interesting when you look at the data, which was compiled through a questionnaire to all of our participating states. If you look at the number of states who, for example, responded and said that they didn't have a strategy for countering disinformation, it's larger than you'd think. The number of states who say we don't have enough resource for countering disinformation, also larger than you think. So I think there's something there around kind of getting all states up to the same basic level of having a strategy, having a clear coordination function, having dedicated resource, which is enough to tackle the problem within their country, but also allowing the flexibility there for their responses to flex in relation to how their state functions. And that's really important because we do hear a lot about the great examples across the Nordic and Baltic region, particularly their investment in digital literacy, media literacy through schools, and then other states sort of coming and saying, how do we replicate that? We want something similar. And my answer is always, well, firstly, in those states, this is long-term investment, which has been there for a very long time, embedded in the curriculum. You can't overnight just turn that on and implement that within your country. It takes time. But also the other thing that's different is understanding the relationship between the population and the state itself. So in those countries, in the Nordic region, in Scandinavia, there is a higher level of trust in the government and a higher level of trust in the media than you get in other parts of Europe. And that can make it easier for some of these programs to be implemented and can make the response easier as well. But again, that's not something that you can just immediately replicate in other countries. So you do need to kind of understand and calibrate it there. But I think the key thing for me is resources, having enough resources is clearly not enough. If we hear that, you know, we think Russia is investing $2 billion per year in its information operations, I'm pretty confident in saying that that is not matched in terms of our response. It's not even going to come even vaguely close to that. So there needs to be a bit more investment in it if we're going to tackle this problem.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll take two more questions, ideally from people who didn't ask in the first round, one at the front and one on the side here. Sorry, you already had one, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you both very much. My name is Shannon O'Connell. I'm with the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. I'm curious to know, that, building on the comments that you both just made about what you were referring to, Martha, as social identifiers and the extent to which this is being quite deliberately targeted for the purposes of creating social division and for the social contract to fail. It's also a way to monetize this work quite significantly. I'd be keen to hear your analysis of where you think we are on that, what the inhibitors are really addressing it as a quite deliberate technique within hybrid threats, rather than just a social issue, as it were. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll take those other two questions if that's okay as well. One at the front and one here. Yes. Yes, hand there.
Hi, this is Peng Shen. I'm with the Taiwan Office of Westminster Foundation for Democracy. So we in Taiwan work with multiple stakeholders in the democratic space, including legislative branch, academia, and also civil society. So as our colleague earlier mentioned about Taiwan's experience and knowledge regarding information operation from China, we also see that the information manipulation here actually harm Taiwan's presence and sabotage Taiwan's further interaction with the European stakeholders as well. So I want to put my question in a more practical manner to both of our speakers. From where you are, do you see the importance of for Europe to work with Taiwan in this manner? And from where you are, how do you see we can work together from different level, from the official to like the civil society? And also just want to chime in that we are actually bringing a delegation of multiple stakeholders, including MPs, staffers in parliament, and also civil society. So some of our MPs are also here in the scene. Feel free to talk to them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And maybe we'll do the one at the front as well.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Mark. I'm a student at Blavatnik School of Government. Before, I worked at the Paris 2024 communication unit during the Olympics. And a dilemma we often face regarding hybrid threats is when to communicate and when to debunk, because there is often in our societies where there is less and less trust in government. There is this question of giving visibility through institutional channels to disinformation, for instance, about Seine River's swimmability, or about Algerian boxer Iman Khalif, who was said to be a man. So what is the good timing to debunk, and how do you assess this dilemma of giving visibility or not to fake news? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a topic close to my heart, certainly. So we have questions on social division and the monetizing of that, on Taiwan's relations. Certainly, I know our previous special committee visited Taiwan, so maybe Mr. Pong would say a bit more about our relations with Taiwan. And finally, the experience of the Olympics that we know was very targeted, and debunking strategy. When is a good time to intervene, and how do we deal with the dilemma of not wanting to give oxygen to untrue stories, but we want to sort of correct the record? What's the right balance to strike there? Who would like to go first?
Want me to go first? Okay. Yeah. On deliberate targeting and weaponization of social identities, so we have a work stream on this, which is led by a colleague of mine. There's a paper that's on our website that sets out some of our initial thoughts on this. But I think one of the things that we are really concerned about going forward is that point around micro-targeting, but also personalization of disinformation narratives. And certainly some of the technical developments that we're starting to see around the use of AI and LLMs makes it much easier for that narrowing to happen. But it also means that the individual themselves is having that narrowing of their own viewpoint. And it makes the disinformation more impactful because it's much more kind of tailored to something that will specifically work in their context. But it also means that what we might see going forward is that if this happens to a lot of people, some of those kind of unifying narratives start to disappear, because what everybody is so used to is such a kind of hyper-personalized, focused narrative that actually these bigger things no longer exist. And that's really challenging from a response perspective, because you don't have that unified narrative that you can continue to draw upon. So I think it is really challenging, and I think we have seen lots of examples, and that piece of work in particular focuses on gender and the way in which this gender in particular is used by hybrid threat actors, and whether we see that focusing on, for example, female members of parliament who tend to experience much higher levels of harassment than their male counterparts. But just in the disinformation space generally, we tend to see that being leaned upon more because it is sadly more effective. And so that work strand is seeking to understand a bit more about how that happens and what the response mechanisms might look like. But it's other minority groups as well that fit into that work strand. And maybe on the kind of, I'll leave Taiwan, but maybe the when to communicate and attribute and giving visibility, I think it is really challenging, and I think there are a number of states who have set up systems which are sort of slightly distant from the government itself, so independent fact-checking organizations who are there and able to respond to incidents as and when they occur can sometimes be more effective, because this is an independent organization rather than the state itself. Some examples of that are Faktabari, which is based in Finland, but also increasingly you see things like BBC Verify, which very quickly, in response to political statements or unfolding events as they happen, will get into the detail of trying to be able to kind of independently say this did happen or this didn't happen. And those are the kinds of initiatives that can really help in that space. So it's not just the government, although in the BBC's case it is state broadcaster. But just, you know, Faktabari is completely separate to that within the Finnish system.
Maybe I'll pick up at that point, because what actually bounds it together physically and mentally, so to say, is the quest for transparency. So being aware of not only where an information comes from, if it's a checked one or not, so if there is a sound base for a headline, for a claim or whatever. Second thing, connected also to the question of a proper functioning media system, because you need, as a democratic society, you need a vibrant and I'd say multiple faceted media system in order to support democracy, meaning let's say the constructive struggle for political opinions, for public opinions in the due course of an ongoing debate with as many actors as possible. And also there, transparency is of utmost importance, financially, but also in terms of, let's say, motives. I mean, when you look at, for example, a German media landscape, everyone knew and knows that the FATS is more conservative than the Frankfurter Rundschau. So when you expect and when you read the Frankfurter Rundschau and you're a conservative, it's like testing your own positions, your own arguments, and so on and so forth. So this is actually, I think, what we need, not only in terms of media structure, but also in terms of public debate. And to a certain extent, we kind of, I think, sometimes need to relearn public, constructive, democratic debates, because I do not need anyone to, or everyone to kind of go along with my opinion. Actually, it's more vibrant, it's more interesting if you're questioning my point of view. And then we go into a debate and define what's probably something we have in common and something where we might still disagree. When and where to communicate. I think the basic starting point is, and I'm now referring more to the member states who do not have, like Martha just said, enough resources, enough tools, enough coordination of bodies or agencies working on that field. Yet, before you decide on when and how to communicate, you need to be aware. And then you can take an informed decision. And of course, sometimes it might be better to just observe, to see where a narrative comes from, where it is picked up, how it is channeled, to understand the scale. And there are sometimes narratives or campaigns where you actually need to single them out publicly because of the gravity of danger, so to say. And this needs to be an informed, and not only an informed, but hopefully also a strategic decision, which also means that member states need to beef up their own strategic communication. And there, not every member state is there yet. Again, referring to French response, because it's the newest kid on the block, I would say an excellent example. As AI was also mentioned, of course, whatever we see as a threat or whatever we see as a danger is multiplied by AI, is multiplied by bot farms, is multiplied by LLMs. And there, I mean, it's an ongoing debate. Everyone following European politics knows that we are also starting the process of, let's say, modernizing, reforming on the run of the implementation our AI rules. I think one of the most important points from my perspective is that we should not, under all circumstances, lose out on experience, lose out on knowledge. So even if we decide not to go in some directions, even if we say we have a European framework that sets out specific railguards, we still need to know how other actors work with AI to understand what we might be facing, although we said under the European rules this is allowed or not allowed. And I think that this is also one of the most important things that we have ahead of us. And again, also picking up one point of the societal divisions. I mean, the basic aim of populistic views or opinions or communication is whatever floats the boat. So I'm always using an example, although I know it's a bit tricky, but we have one political actor here in Germany who, at the beginning of the corona pandemic, basically asked for the toughest measures ever possible. Until member states started to realize that indeed what might lay ahead of us can be really challenging for health system, for society, for each and every one individually, and they're starting to implement precautionary measures. I mean, there's also an ongoing discussion also here in the German Bundestag on whether each of all those measures was right or not. This is what we also do in a democracy, to look at the instruments we had used and to assess whether we would use them again or not. But under that circumstances back then, as soon, and it was not only Germany, but also other member states within the European Union, as soon as member states started to implement measures, the communication of that actor completely flipped around. And then it was kind of the narrative of the freedom fighters against the state. While I'm saying that is we need to be aware of the underlying narratives, because that also helps differentiating vulnerabilities, targeted groups in that sense. And I would say the most frequent underlying narrative is the state will not be able to kind of serve your cause, whatever it is, under no circumstances. And there we are not only at state level, but also on society level at the core of the damaging thing, because it's singling out individuals. It's kind of creating the atmosphere of whatever you do, you're alone, and you cannot trust anyone. You cannot trust the state, you cannot trust the media, you cannot trust the schools, you cannot trust your friends. And this is what makes disinformation so harmful for society. And then, of course, our answers need to be also built on that. And to the Taiwan question, let me probably refer to it with what the basic idea of the European Union, specifically speaking as a member of this country, a citizen of this country here, the European Union was founded on the principles of cooperation is better than it being adversaries. Respecting each and everyone's rules, sovereignty, territory. And more importantly, because it's not only connected to Taiwan, but to a lot of geopolitical questions, borders are not changed by force. This is the basic fundamental principle of the European Union. And back to my own country, it allowed us, after the horrific atrocities of the Second World War, to come back to the society of free and democratic states of the world. And you can also hear via that the plea for ourselves to remind ourselves of where we did come from as European Union, as state, and why we were so successful in building up that union. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mark, you asked quite an operational question, so I'll just add a word in terms of when do we intervene. Just to answer in terms of the European Parliament administration, we look at the evolution of a narrative. So if we see false narrative go from one language to many languages, from one platform to many platforms, from social media to traditional media, these would be the kind of triggers that would lead us to intervene and debunk more proactively. So I think we have time for one more round of questions. Is that right, Thilo?
Soon. That was from Joanna Bryson. She's a professor of ethics and technology at the Hertie School of Government, and she gets struck down by flu. So she had a short question, I think mostly to Martha. The question is about interference at the time of elections. Is anyone covering the lone wolf violence that coincides, question marks, how do you say that? Anführungszeichen. Well, you know what I mean. Coincides with elections. I think she's referring to this, we had a number of knife attacks just ahead of the last federal elections in Germany. And she wanted to know if you have singled this out, if you can tell us a bit more about this.
Should we take that together with one or two more? How are we doing at time? I think we've still got a few minutes. There's one here and one behind you as well. And we'll come to you.
Okay, my name is Michael Radunsky. I'm a journalist working for SZ Dossier Geoeconomics. And my question is, we have an ongoing debate about whether Huawei or ZTE, Chinese companies, should be allowed in our telecom networks. Is that a hybrid threat, and how should we deal with that?
Okay, one final one maybe in the corner. Who's been waiting? Yes, we will come back.
Hi, my name is Florian Frank. I'm from the Cyfluence Research Center. We're focused on information disorder and cyber operations. You were mentioning that when you see a campaign running and it reaches a certain stage, that is when you intervene. What does intervention mean? And the reason I'm asking is previously you were mentioning in your talk the doppelganger campaign. Now, this is probably the most researched campaign we know. all the way down to the individuals in the SDA, the company running it, and we have the emails, internal emails, etc. The reason we have this is because the Americans took action. And the doppelganger campaign, until today, is running freely. And there's nothing that we're doing, nothing. And I think this is one of the core issues that in Europe, we constantly analyze, we talk about organizations like ours and the need to do things. But at the end, it always comes down to reaction. We're not proactive. And I think this is the fundamental issue. So again, I wanted to answer, you actually, I think, semi-answered it, like, we bring pre-bunking. Now, if I look at the situation right now in the information sphere, we're losing. We're losing on every single front in every single country. And yet, we're still stuck in the same cycles of discussions of, you know, like pre-bunking and all these kind of things, but we're not willing to take the next step. So is there any debate within Europe actually, you know, looking at the geopolitical situation to maybe grow up, get a little bit, you know, of courage and actually move a little bit to the outside? Because right now, anyone can do whatever they want in Europe from the outside.
Thank you very much. That's already 3 questions, so I will come to you. If we have time, we will hopefully have one more round after that. So we had quite a bit of diverse things there, everything from telecoms to doppelganger to feel free. Who would like to go first?
The first question was on Germany in particular. I don't know whether you want to talk about that.
Yep, I would say, because let me pick up here the questions. Probably starting with the one that was posted online on the lonesome actors and the election. How shall I say it without saying Europe is monitoring, because everyone is fed up with monitoring and with papers and with wake-up calls, by the way, which goes a bit into your direction, but I'm happy to comment on that as well. So when you look at the European level and the comparatives also to other member states, there is a pattern. And this pattern is getting more violently, actually, not only connected to elections, but of course, in the run-up to elections, the impact on society is exaggerated, is kind of multiplied in that. Coming a bit back to what I said previously, and also here it is true, remember the kind of trinity I was mentioning between internal security, our actors at European level there, building up on the cooperation with police, but also with intelligence in the member states. So we need this kind of cooperation to actually address it together. Surprisingly, although the gentleman has left, but the question of critical infrastructure and Mercosur somewhat are not necessarily on content, but also again in terms of pattern connected. Because what we try at European level and what we're doing basically with our policy initiatives and with our laws is diversifying. Diversifying because we see that dependencies on one or two, depending on the field, actors actually increases, well, it's a no-brainer, by the way, it increases vulnerabilities. Which is, to a certain extent, why the Mercosur vote was so politically sensitive. It was mentioned I was also a member of the Agriculture Committee, substitute member. I come from a very rural area, so we had, for good reasons, been fighting intensively for a good, not only working atmosphere, but regulatory body for agriculture sector. Because food security basically is also one of the most prominent securities that a society needs, besides communication, besides energy, besides public administration, financing, and so on and so forth. So food security is something that is at the very heart of resilience and preparedness. So we have been fighting, and we also have been adapting and changing European laws that had gone into the wrong direction. Mercosur was a way of diversifying, partially with a problematic part for parts of agriculture. So when you look at the landscape, there are agriculture sectors that benefit, and there are basically two where there might be repercussions. This is why we built up the protection measures connected to the Mercosur agreement, and we added additional money in order to support our European agriculture sector. Having said that, the vote in Parliament was not about the content of the agreement. It was a political question between the Commission and the Parliament. And there couldn't have been any worse timing of that. When everyone was meeting in Davos, when we had basically experienced a week where we went from 10% tariffs because we protect Greenland to 200% tariffs because Macron was apparently raising medicine prices, which he didn't. And in that week, we basically undermined our own credibility at international level. And this is what is so frustrating about that vote. Again, it was a democratic process. We will work with the outcome, but the gravity, scale and intensity, you remember that from the beginning of that vote, will hit us back. It will bite back. By the way, also institutionally for a parliament, because if I as a parliamentarian say, I'm not able to take a decision, we need to ask for the court, I probably should should question my own role as a parliamentarian. Of course we take complex decisions, we take difficult decisions, we take also our time to assess things. But at a certain point, we also need to bear the responsibility for what we are voting on. And why is that connected to critical infrastructure? Because also there, diversity is key. And if we know that we have vulnerabilities already in our systems, then of course we need to rule them out. And preferably in a coordinated European way, with a European assessment of the vulnerabilities and also of the technical means to that. And now coming back and try to be short, to the question that you were just mentioning. What are we doing at European level? Basically, you kind of elegantly, although very, well, politically, I would say, summarized the very reason why we formed the EUDS. Because from our perspective at European level, what the member states are doing at individual level is not enough. We're not doing that because we want to have all the competences or because we think we are brighter than everyone else. We're doing that because we see that member states' responses are not where they should be by now. And we are trying to get them to move also in the right direction, which is, by the way, also that at European level, we will always build on the responses from member states, because this is how the European Union works. So we need both levels to take up responsibility. And again, coming back to the basic idea of this event here today, for that, you need everyone to be aware of the threat. And I would say, we can discuss it later on because I see your reaction, but if you have a specific security bubble, for example, everyone knows what the risk is. Everyone knows what the answer could and should be. Outside that security bubble, rather sure that we're not there yet.
Maybe just a comment on telecoms networks. So at the Hybrid CoE, we wouldn't advise our participating states on whether or not they should enter into a partnership with Huawei. That is for them to come to that decision. But I think if we look at critical national infrastructure more broadly, it has been a trend for a long time that some states are seeking to sell off parts of their critical national infrastructure to overseas buyers and seeking that inward investment from other states into their systems in order to build new systems, and particularly we're thinking about 5G here. Whether or not it's a hybrid threat, I think what we try to do is to encourage states to really think through the implications of any partnership that they enter into, and that point around sort of, are they investing too much with one particular actor? What do those vulnerabilities look like? How do they make sure that they have everything in place to guard against that? But, you know, the situation that we find ourselves in is that this is just a broader trend where states are seeking that investment from other countries, and you can't often build a lot of this new infrastructure without it. So, you know, you just have to make sure that you have the right safeguards in place and that you have the right analysis leading to the judgment that you end up making. rather than the hybrid CoE saying yes or no to any particular thing. On this point around, are we proactive enough? Are we doing enough? I think for me the answer is no. But I recognise that this is a very difficult fiscal environment for a lot of the participating states that we work with, and that is really difficult, and they're having to make really difficult choices around how they prioritise the work that they're doing. But the one thing that I would say on this, and sort of the work that I see on countering FEMI across Europe, and so I come from a privileged position at the Hybrid CoE in that we do build relationships with our participating states, and through that we get to see privileged insight into how their systems are responding. And I would say there is a lot of work that is going on that is not made public for good reason. And I think actually the depth and the breadth of the activity in some of the participating states is really impressive. It's not across all of them. They're at different stages of their journey on this, but I think if we can continue to move in the right direction, that is a positive thing. But I have certainly heard over the last 6 months or so growing voices to say, it's not enough. It's not just about being defensive. We should be offensive as well. So I think that fits into that kind of narrative, and I think is the direction that you were going in as well. So, you know, it's a conversation to have, but I think one of the things that we have that's to our advantage is our adherence to international legal norms. And we need to be very mindful of that going forward if we start to think about some other options in this space.
Thank you very much. I think we've got about 7 minutes left, so if we do a couple of quick fire. I know there's 2 people who are very keen to come in on the last round, so if you could make your question relatively quick fire, one here and then one in the middle afterwards.
Hi, this is Christian from Romania. I'm coming from that type of Romanian elections that you've mentioned. 2 very short questions. One for Lena. You've been talking about European Parliament level measures to defend democracy. What about those European citizens who say democracy is not something that we need anymore? And the other question to Martha. You've been talking about fact-checking as a measure to counter hybrid threats. Does it work? Or let's put it from the other part. What works better than just doing fact-checking? Because if people would be just logical, well, I'm afraid you would lose your job. So what works better than just fact-checking? Thank you.
Thank you. And one question there in the middle, right behind the camera stand, if you see. Yep.
Thank you so much. My name is Vana Monici, also from Romania. I'm working at Context.ro, an investigative media startup. And I also have a question, since Ms. Turnbull mentioned the fact that there is a certain cooperation between hybrid threat actors and also certain domestic interferences, which are often overlooked. I obviously thought about the MEGA movement. So I was wondering, how do you approach that type of movement? And this relates me to the second question. That is, in our elections, we saw that a candidate was removed from the list, and also we had a round of elections that were cancelled. So I was wondering, what do we do in terms of interference so that we can still protect democracy but also maintain the trust of people in the fairness of the electoral process? And the last part is regarding following the money and everything related to transparency. Because we saw that on the border of Romania there were certain Chinese surveillance cameras, for example, and certain colleagues from the press outlined this. And also we had the doppelganger episode in Romania as well, which was absolutely overlooked, and also we still don't know what happened with Călin Georgescu on TikTok and where the money came from. So 2 small questions here. What do we do about transparency in this case, and what is the EU doing specifically? And 2, what do we do about the TikTok regulations and everything related to the algorithms which are favorizing basically anti-democratic movements and extremist movements?
Thank you very much. So Mission Impossible for the last 5 minutes. Democracy, trust, implementation of legislation, if you could give some final thoughts on that.
Yes, sure. Fact-checking, first of all. I mean, I think on all of this, when we're talking about disinformation, there's always going to be a portion of the population that you just simply can't reach. And any initiative that's introduced is not really targeted at that portion of the population. You have to kind of accept that there will always be people who will not agree. And you know, that's that is fine. But what you're trying to do is to reach the portion of the population who you can have that conversation with. And fact-checking is one way of doing that, is to be able to have a trusted source that the population can turn to in times when they're sort of questioning what the information that's provided to them, and they know that they can rely on that fact-checking organisation to do that. But in order for that to happen, you need a population that is able to have that questioning in the first place. And that's where your kind of critical thinking and your media literacy and all of that good investment comes into it as well. And I think sometimes the thing that is overlooked in that space is that it tends to be very focused on schools and on young people. And I worry slightly that there are portions of the population that are left behind by that. And I know that some states across Europe are seeking to rectify that now and invest in, for example, adult education through libraries. But I do think at the minute we're sort of missing that bit of it. So yes, ideally fact-checking exists as part of a broader resilience program where states are seeking to invest in making sure that their population are able to engage with the information as critically as they possibly can and find the information that they need. Maybe, given that in the interest of time, maybe I'll also just talk about financing, because I didn't talk about that when I was giving my introductory remarks, but I think it is really important. Everybody always says follow the money, and they're absolutely right. But what's really difficult to do is to follow the money when we're talking about cryptocurrency. And I know that there are a number of states across Europe that are actively looking at new legislation to try and tackle this. States already have legislation in place which looks at electoral financing and making sort of clear on where that money is coming from, whether it's to political parties or to individuals. But what that legislation cannot currently do in some cases is to tackle cryptocurrency. And so that's why I think states are now looking at investing in how they can alter that to be able to tackle it more effectively. Because a lot of the recent cases that we have seen, whether it's Romania, whether it's Moldova, or even in the case of some of the other things that we've seen across Europe around individual politicians, the link has always been cryptocurrency. And so if we can do more to better legislate against that threat, I think that will really help us going forward. Final thing for me on social media and algorithms, I think this is something where there has been a lot of attention, but also a lot of progress with some of the platforms. Not all of them, but some of them have taken great steps in order to improve the security around their platforms and also their engagement with governments. So I think it's not all negative in that space, and we can talk offline about that.
Well, probably I'll pick up on that point. I'm not saying by that the DSA is the answer to everything, because it's not. But it is an important tool in that area of cooperation, and if there's no cooperation, also of sanctioning large online platforms, and specifically very large, so-called flops, very large online platforms here as well. And there TikTok is one of those platforms where we seek the engagement with the, I would say, carrot and the stick at the same time. So you can trust the European Commission of, in that sense, not only monitoring and following it, but also considering the actions to react. Not only on TikTok, by the way, but you see that there is a cool-headed reaction from the European Commission in the enforcement of the DSA. And that same goes, picking up and supporting what Martha just had said on the question of cryptocurrency, but also the follow the money architecture at European level has recently been updated and will be updated further on. Which leads me to the first, and in my version, the last question here. And I guess it's no surprise, because you heard it previously in one of the other statements. We should never take democracy for granted. Never. And funnily enough, this is quite often said by a generation who had grown up in a democracy. And this is where my plea comes in. Democracy can be demanding. It is complex. It involves people. It involves different opinion. Also very difficult decisions to be taken, and also losing sometimes in an argument or a political decision. This is what democracy is about, the engagement around it. And so far, I have not seen any political system that at the same time can guarantee the individual freedom, social stability, economic prosperity. In brackets, we all know that we have huge tasks to do there in this country and also at the European level. And at the same time, make sure that whatever kind of institution or processes we're having is as neutral as possible. Because the focus is on people building up this democracy or this state. And this is what we need to nurture, again, also in the question you raised. So how to react to someone who says democracy is a kind of, well, not the best system? Engage in that discussion. Convince that he can only or she can only say that because we are in a democracy. And the last example for that, because I think it's so adamant to it, and it's connected to the question of free speech and the various interpretation of that. A prominent Russian figure engaging on X via VPN, lecturing the European Union of freedom of speech. Who needs another example?
That's a great final thought. Let's not take democracy for granted. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank you for your very perceptive and insightful questions. Thank you to the speakers for their comments. Thanks very much to the European Parliament Liaison Office for hosting us and to the technicians. Thilo, would you like to say a final word? We look forward to continuing these discussions at the Political Tech Summit.
Very simple remarks. Before you rush out, grab a bite, take a coffee. Otherwise, my colleagues and me will spend the whole weekend eating finger food. And you'll find the restrooms behind the cloakrooms if you're looking for that. And then many thanks to your patience. Many thanks to our speakers, Chris, for this great moderation. I wish you a fruitful summit. Josef told me those of you who have to go to the summit, it'll take you about 30 minutes with public transport to get there. So take your time, have a bite, stay around for a chat. Lena has to leave immediately. I think Martha has a bit more time if you're interested in following up. And obviously, my colleagues and me will be here. Thank you very much.